Good evening and welcome back to This Can
Can't
Happen.
hear you.
You hear me? Welcome back to This Can Happen, lesson 6. Till now we discussed the background of Mashiach, why it's important, how we're headed in that direction, and about Mashiach himself. Today we're going to conclude the course with discussing...
Cannot hear you.
You don't hear me? Raise your hand if you hear me. Roberta, you have to turn up your volume.
Okay, I can hear you.
Okay. So today we're going to discuss the era of Mashiach. What will things look like when Mashiach comes? What will the world look like when Mashiach comes? Will everything stay the same? Or will things change? Which things will change? Which things will stay the same? And I'm sure all of us have heard various things about the era of Mashiach, what will be when Mashiach comes. We've all heard of different miracles that will happen when Mashiach comes. But the question is, what does Torah tell us about it? You see, the famous saying of it's hard to make predictions, especially about the future, which is true when we're talking about mortal beings, when we're talking about human beings. But when we're talking about God, when we're talking about the Torah and the Torah and the prophets give us an understanding of what will be when Mashiach comes, specifically through the prophetic verses of Yeshayahu and Yirmiyahu, Isaiah and Jeremiah. And that's why we're comfortable discussing what will be, what will the future look like. But not everything on this subject is knowable, because by definition, any discussion on this topic is incomplete, because we'll only know what will happen when it'll actually happen, as well as we're trying to fit it into just over an hour. And so it's not going to be an exhaustive idea or analyzing the entirety of the topic of what the world will look like in the future, but at least it'll give us a glimpse into what the future will be. And so we'll begin with a passage from Maimonides, and as we discussed last week, the importance of Maimonides' final 2 chapters in his book of laws, which he concludes the laws of the entire Torah, and he concludes with 2 chapters, the laws of the coming of Mashiach. And so tonight's class will be based primarily on Maimonides, which is obviously culled from the Midrash, the Talmud, and so on, the verses. And so we will begin with text 1a on page 247, with an interesting idea of the era of Mashiach as put forth by Maimonides. And here's what Maimonides says. Do not presume that in the Messianic age, any facet of the world's nature will change, or that there will be innovations in the work of creation. The world will continue according to its pattern. The world will be natural. Everything, says Maimonides, will be natural. The world that we live in will be natural. When Mashiach comes, nature will not change. Don't think that there'll have to be any change. There won't suddenly be people with 5 eyes. We won't suddenly have eyes in the back of our head. We won't suddenly, things will mega transform. No, it'll be exactly the way it is. In other words, Maimonides seems to be saying that miracles won't occur in the Messianic era. And we'll get to it in a moment. Yes, there will be amazing and drastic changes, but within nature, not changing the rules of nature. But there's a verse, text 1b, the verse from Isaiah chapter 11. The famous verse, the wolf will dwell with the lamb, the leopard will lie down with the young goat, the calf and the yearling will be with the lion, and a little child will lead them all. Now you tell me, what does that verse sound like? Running the rules of nature, or is it going against nature? Going against nature. These are clearly miraculous statements. The wolf will lie with the lamb, and led by a child. So how can Maimonides say that there won't be any major changes, there won't be any miracles, there'll be drastic changes, amazing things, but it won't be miraculous, changing the way how nature operates? Isaiah seems to say very clearly that in the Messianic era it will be. And so Maimonides actually reconciles this issue. And he continues in chapter 12 of his Laws of Kings, text 1c, page 249. And he explains as follows: the wolf will dwell with the lamb, the leopard will lie down with the young goat. The verse from Isaiah. Those words, says Maimonides, are an allegory and parable. The interpretation of the prophecy is that the Jews will dwell at peace together with those wicked Gentiles who had sought to devour them like a wolf and leopard. They will no longer steal or destroy, but live at peace with Israel. Similarly, other Messianic prophecies of this kind are allegories. Only in the Messianic era will we understand their true meaning. And so says Maimonides, that reminds me of a joke. It says it's hard to explain puns to kleptomaniacs because they take everything literally. Maimonides is explaining that the verses from the prophets that talk about miraculous changes in nature in the Messianic era are allegories, are metaphorical. They're not to be taken literally. What's the metaphor of? The wolf will lie with the lamb. The lion will lie, the wolf will dwell with the lamb. The leopard will lie down with the young goat. That's a metaphor for the anti-Semites, for those who have been devouring the Jewish nation like a wolf devours a lamb. When Mashiach comes, all nations will live at peace, and everyone will live at peace with the Jewish people. No one, the end of anti-Semitism, what we're all waiting for. And Maimonides follows along those lines here in the same chapter, chapter 12, text 2, page 250, the same idea. Text 2. Our sages taught there will be no difference between the current age and the Messianic era, except the emancipation from our subjugation to the Gentile governments. Maimonides is emphasizing his point. Here's another one which seemingly, throughout the verses, there's many miracles. Says Maimonides, quoting from the Talmud, that no, the Talmud says clearly there won't be any changes. The only difference between nowadays and the Messianic era will be that we will be emancipated from all outside influence. We'll have independence. Now, Jewish independence, we all know there's the state of Israel, and there is Jewish independence there, but can you really call that Jewish independence? Jerusalem is constantly waiting to get the approval from Washington, from Moscow, from this one, from that one. What does number 10 have to say? What does the White House have to say? Tremendously influenced by the entirety of the world, and not only the big people, the big guns, but they're influenced by social media, they're influenced by the world's, what the world thinks. So yes, it's somewhat of an independence, but it isn't full independence. In the era of Mashiach, it will be entirely independent. The Jewish people will be able to live their lives exactly how they want to, following the laws of the Torah, having a Jewish king without having any outside influence whatsoever. And Jews will use that power to spread light and kindness throughout the world. And so the first point we have on what's going to be when Mashiach comes is exactly, according to Maimonides, nothing miraculous changing the course of nature. When Mashiach comes, nature will stay exactly the same. This that we see throughout the prophecies of Isaiah, of Jeremiah, and elsewhere, various terms and verses that speak about miracles which change the rules of nature, those are allegories and metaphors. Yes, there will be drastic change. There will be amazing changes. Antisemitism will be obliterated. The world will be at peace, which is miraculous in the kind of borrowed term of something amazing happening, but it isn't out of the rules of nature. It's not the sun going backwards. It isn't the wolf lying with the lamb. The world will be exactly the same. Anti-Semitism will end, and there will be Jewish independence. Following that, Maimonides goes on to explain another aspect of what will be with the coming of Mashiach in the Messianic era, following his view of unmiraculous changes that will transpire in the Messianic era. Here we have text 3. Dr. Herman, can you read for us text 3 on page 251?
(251), spurred by Mashiach. Is that the one?
Yeah, the text 3.
Proceeding with Maimonides' description of the redemption.
No, text 3. Just below that.
The Messianic king will arise and renew the Davidic dynasty, restoring it to its initial sovereignty. He will build the temple and gather the dispersed of Israel. In his days, the observance of all the statutes will return to their previous state.
Thank you. Last lesson, we discussed what it means to renew the Davidic dynasty, because Mashiach will be a direct descendant from King David, who will be the king. Following that, Maimonides says in the Messianic era, Mashiach will build the temple, gather the dispersed of Israel, and restore the observance of all of the mitzvot. What do these 3 items mean that will happen in the Messianic era? So let's begin with the building of the temple. You see, the building of the temple was a historic hope for the Jewish people. From the destruction of the Second Temple, close to 2,000 years ago, up until now, it's something which was a constant idea, constant imagery throughout all the history. And if you look on page 252, you see a classic Haggadah from 1730, but it's just, it's imagery that has been used throughout all of our history, this yearning for the rebuilding of the temple. May it be speedily in our days. The temple will be rebuilt on Temple Mount. What is the temple? Here's a short clip which will give us an idea of the workings of the temple and what the temple looked like. Obviously, we don't know exactly what the temple looked like. We weren't there. And so it's hard for us to know exactly what the temple will look like. But based on Ezekiel's prophecy, based on the Talmud and the Mishnah, we do have a general idea of what the temple will look like with the coming of Mashiach.
God told the Jews at Sinai to build a temple so that his presence could dwell among them, a place to worship, to gather as a nation, to receive atonement, inspiration, and instruction. Half a millennia later, God's desired location for a permanent home was revealed to King David in the ancient city of Jerusalem, atop a hillside known for Abrahamic times as Mount Moriah. David's son, King Solomon, completed a magnificent structure that attracted the title Beit HaMikdash and Beit HaPirah. It was fashioned with much gold, expensive woods, and precious materials. When it was completed in 827 BCE, the nation gathered to witness God's presence fill the temple. The mountain gained a new name, Har Habayit. At its summit, a stone building rose to enormous height. Within its gaping entrance was the Ulam, a lobby, beyond which was the Kodesh, furnished with 3 golden items: an altar for incense, a 7-branched menorah, and a table with racks for the showbread. At the sanctuary's far end, a separated area enclosed the temple's core, its most sacred location, the Kodesh HaKodashim, that held the Oron, the Ark of God, containing the tablets that Moses delivered at Sinai. The Ark of God rested upon a naturally protruding plateau known as the Foundation Rock. Immediately outside the building, the courtyard of the Kohanim, priests, held a massive stone sacrificial altar with a lengthy access ramp. Nearby was the Kior, a cistern for rinsing hands and feet, and a platform for the Levites to chant psalms and play instruments. Further back, a larger area was designed for public assembly, known as the Women's Courtyard. It included an extensive wooden balcony for women. The nation would gather 3 times each year to celebrate the festivals of Pesach, Shavuot, and Sukkot. The compound was surrounded by a massive wall and contained a series of steps, numerous gateways, and guard posts. The temple's layout was exceptionally efficient, with compartments and chambers for every possible need, such as storage areas for wood, oil, and other materials, production and preparation areas, rooms for clothing, for weaponry in case of attack, ritual immersion pools, sleeping and eating areas, tool and instrument reserves, lockers for the priests, a charity room, a hall for Torah study, a chamber for the Sanhedrin, a lounge for temple officials, a repair workshop, animal holdings, ticket stations, and so on. There were separate entrances for distinct purposes, an oversight system, and honor guards. A small stream ran beneath the temple, which was used to maintain cleanliness. The temple stood for 4 centuries. It was destroyed by the Babylonian army in 423 BCE, rebuilt in 349 BCE, and stood for 4 centuries more until it was destroyed by the Romans in 69 of the Common Era. Through his prophets, God promised the Jews a 3rd and eternal temple in the Messianic era, from which his presence will spread to the world, embracing all of humanity.
Now, the first question that comes to mind, obviously, if in the Messianic era, we'll have the temple will be rebuilt on Temple Mount. We all know that there are other buildings of notes currently on the Temple Mount. And how does that add up? How is that going to work? So someone asked a question last week. We gave some suggestions. But first of all, if this is an indicator, if we needed any, that yes, Mashiach isn't here yet. But in the Messianic era, the nations of the world, including the nations that reside in the Middle East, will happily enable the building of the temple in its place. Because after all, as we explained in lessons 2, 3, 4, what is the Messianic era? The era when God's presence will be palpably felt throughout the entire world. There won't be any more concealment. The entire world will recognize the great value that the Beis HaMikdash, the temple, has for them as a source of physical blessing and spiritual direction. As a matter of fact, the sages tell us that had only they knew, the nations of the world knew what the temple does for them, they would have never destroyed it in the first place. Text form, a quote from the Midrash, page 253. If the nations of the world knew how beneficial the holy temple was for them, they would have surrounded it with fortifications in order to guard it. Not only they wouldn't have destroyed it, they would have guarded it on their own. And so yes, exile is a state of concealment. And so the Romans and the Babylonians had no idea what the temple was doing because there was that heavy concealment. But if we assume that there's no way that the nations will agree to the rebuilding of the 3rd temple when Mashiach comes, then we're also falling prey to that concealment. And so we should expect this to change in the Messianic era, that the nations of the world will all recognize what the temple does for them, without exception, they will all recognize it, and so they will gladly assist and enable the building of the Beis HaMikdash. And this is actually one of the underlying messages of many of the prophecies in Isaiah. Here's one of the first prophecies of Isaiah, text 250, page 254, text 5, Isaiah chapter 2. Roberta, can you read for us text 5 on page 254?
The word that Isaiah, son of Amos, prophesied concerning Judah and Jerusalem. It shall be at the end of the days that the mountain of God's home shall be firmly established at the top of the mountains. It shall be raised above the hills, and all the nations shall stream to it. Many peoples shall go, and they shall say, "Come, let us go up to God's mountain, to the house of the God of Jacob, and let him teach us of his ways, and we will go in his paths."
Thank you. So what do we see? What's Isaiah saying? That when Mashiach comes, all the nations of the world will recognize what the temple does for them, and they will all travel to the temple. All of them. Which brings to kind of a parenthetic point, and that is that the Jewish vision for redemption is not exclusively Jewish. It's not exclusively for the Jews. The redemption will be in Hashem's perfect world. The redemption will be for the entire world, Jews and non-Jews alike. Jews will be Jews, non-Jews will remain non-Jews, and they too will experience redemption. There won't be this mass conversion where everyone will become Jews. No, Hashem created the world with a purpose, and every person has a purpose. Jews have their purpose, non-Jews have their purpose, and when Mashiach comes, that won't change. Non-Jews will still be non-Jews. Yes, they'll all keep the 7 Noahide laws. Many non-Jews keep the 7 Noahide laws today. When Mashiach comes, all of the world, all the other nations will all keep the 7 Noahide laws, and will all recognize the uniqueness and the specialty and the importance of the Holy Temple, and they will all travel there. And so redemption in the Jewish perspective is a universal concept. And so what we have here is in the Messianic era, says Maimonides, will be the building of the temple on Mount Sinai, on Temple Mount, Mount Moriah. That's what will be. And again, it doesn't have to be miraculous. It's going to be something which will be within nature, says Maimonides. Then comes his second point. And the second point that Maimonides made was that there'll be the ingathering of the exiles, gathering the dispersed of Israel. It's important to note that when Maimonides wrote his code of law, it was specific in the wording, specific in the manner of writing, and specific in the order as well. And so over here as well, where does he place the ingathering of the exiles? Following the building of the temple. And both of these, the ingathering of the exiles and the building of the temple, are facilitated and come about through King Mashiach, not before the coming of Mashiach. Why is that important? By placing the gathering of the dispersed of Israel following the building of the temple, Maimonides is telling us is that the building of the temple is what will trigger the gathering of the dispersed of Israel. Throughout history, there's been many aliyahs, many waves of aliyahs, many waves of people going to Israel. Till today, there's many people, millions of people that go to Israel. But when Mashiach comes, the drive of everyone, every single last Jew will be to go to Jerusalem, to go to Israel, because the temple will draw them to Israel, not because of persecution, not because of feeling uncomfortable in other countries, not because of any other side reason, but because the temple will draw them near the temple. And its divine energy will draw them there. And so a temple aliyah will be completely different because every single Jew will be inspired by it and will want to have their share in its surroundings. One of the most fascinating aspects of this subject about the ingathering of the exiles is the topic of the return of the 10 lost tribes. And again, we're kind of pressed for time, so we'll just go through the topic in a short manner. Just to recap, who are the 10 lost tribes? The 10 lost tribes, the Jewish people are comprised of 12 tribes, or 13 tribes, counting Joseph is 2. But generally speaking, the Jewish people were 12 tribes. King Solomon, the leader of the Jewish people, the king over the Jewish people, built the second temple. Following his reign, the Jewish monarchy was split in two. There were the 10 tribes that were in northern Israel, led by the Israelite kings. And then there were the 2 tribes in mid and central and southern Israel, which were the tribes of Judah and Benjamin, Yehuda and Benjamin, along with many of the priests and the Levites. And so there were some priests and Levites, many priests and Levites amongst the tribes of Judah and Benjamin in the Judean kingdom. And then there was the 10 tribes in northern Israel, part of the Israelite kingdom. And that split happened following King Solomon's reign. In middle of the era of the Second Temple, roughly between 574 and 556 BCE, the Assyrians invaded northern Israel a number of times and exiled those 10 tribes from northern Israel to faraway lands. That was more than 125 years before the destruction of the First Temple, before the remainder of the Jews were exiled to Babylon with the famous first exile, the Babylonian exile. When they destroyed Jerusalem, they destroyed the temple. So from this point on, when we discuss in the Talmud, when we discuss in the verses, the story of Purim, etc., that was all about the southern kingdom, the Judean kingdom, the kingdom that comprised of the 2 tribes of Judah and Benjamin, which is why we got the name Jews, because of the tribe of Judah. And that was a large chunk of the Jewish population at the time, because the rest of them were lost due to the Assyrians exiling them to faraway lands. Where did they go? The fate of the 10 tribes is a mystery. The Torah, the verses in the prophets do state to which cities they were taken to which lands they were taken to, but placing those names on a map has proven to be very tough throughout the ages. There isn't a consensus and there isn't a knowledge of where those lands are. And there's been many speculations about what happened with the 10 tribes, including many different accounts of people attempting to locate them and to learn about their fortunes. But the question really is, and really relevant to our discussion, is what will happen with the coming of Mashiach? Are they part of the ingathering of the exiles? And so let's have a look on page 255, text 6 from the Mishnah, from the Talmud. There's an interesting debate in the Talmud. The 10 tribes are not destined to return. As it is stated, God cast them into another land like this day. Just as the day passes, never to return, so have they gone into exile, never to return. This is the view of Rabbi Akiva. Rabbi Eliezer stated, like this day, just as the day darkens and then brightens, so the 10 tribes who experience darkness will in the future experience light. In other words, they will be part of the ingathering of exiles. There are many different commentaries and opinions on exactly what this Talmudic debate is about and what it really means. Here's one of the opinions, one of the explanations on this Mishnah. First point, he says, is let's narrow the scope and explain that there's elsewhere in the Talmud, it tells us that the prophet Yirmiyahu, Jeremiah, actually went out searching for the 10 tribes, found them somewhat successful, and he brought back some of them. In other words, amongst us, amongst the Jewish people, in the known Jewish population throughout the world, there are members of each one of the tribes, not just of the 2 tribes, because the prophet Jeremiah went, found them, and brought back some of them. And so at the coming of Mashiach, everyone, whether it's the opinion of Rabbi Akiva or the opinion of Rabbi Eliezer, all opinions agree that when Mashiach comes, all 12 tribes will be part of the ingathering of the exile. The only difference is these people don't have the tribal identities, and when Mashiach comes, everyone will have their tribal identities. And so what's the debate? He explains as follows. The debate is about those tribes, the members of the 10 tribes that did not return with the prophet Jeremiah. Those that didn't return with the prophet Jeremiah, remember, they were assimilated in their local nations. They didn't have the oral Torah because none of the oral Torah was written at that time. And so they didn't have the oral Torah. They don't have the Talmud, and they don't have all the discussions of Jewish law and so on and so forth. And so they slowly but surely started getting assimilated in their local environments. Some retained their tradition that they are Jews, but stopped behaving as Jews. And some of them accepted, most of them accepted their local custom, even idolatrous customs. Idolatry. Others assimilated to the degree that they forgot about being Jewish, even if they retained some of the Jewish practices, but they forgot totally and entirely about their being Jewish, is how far they assimilated. And this is the debate of Rabbi Akiva and Rabbi Eliezer, how we interpret the word day. According to Rabbi Akiva, he feels that this unfortunate process of assimilation, it severed these people's connection with the Jewish nation for good. And so even with the coming of Mashiach, they will not be returned to, they're lost to eternity. Rabbi Eliezer, however, believes that nothing could separate these people from the Jewish nation. And so the 10 lost tribes, when Mashiach comes, it will be clear to them and everyone that they are Jews and that they will take part in the ingathering of the exiles. Either way, when Mashiach comes, whether it's according to Rabbi Eliezer or according to Rabbi Akiva, whether the entirety of the 10 tribes will be returned or not, when it comes to Israel, when it comes to the gathering of the dispersed, all 12 tribes will have a portion in the land. And if you look on page 256, you see one of the most famous pages of an ancient Haggadah that's been reprinted countless times in countless books. Here's a Haggadah from Amsterdam in 1695, and it has a clear layout of the map of Israel, what it'll look like when Mashiach comes, with splitting up the land according to all 10 tribes, according to all 12 tribes, because everyone always had that belief, and it's part and parcel of this idea that when Mashiach comes, the gathering of the exiles will include all 12 tribes. Now, I'd just like to mention parenthetically, yes, there have been various nations throughout the history who have come up and said that they are Jews, whether it's the Bnei Menashe, Bnei Moshe, the Ethiopians, far from India, from China. We don't know. And because we don't know, the consensus amongst the leading rabbinic authorities throughout all the ages was that all these people, it could be, it could not be, we have no idea. And so all of them have to go through a conversion process if they'd like to join and assimilate within the Jewish community. Because it's impossible to know who is from the 10 lost tribes. And even if they are from the 10 lost tribes, as we mentioned earlier, they did not have the oral law. They didn't have any of the laws transcribed. And so they did assimilate with their local populations, which leads to many, many issues, marriage and divorce and so on and so forth, intermarriage. And so the consensus amongst the rabbis is that they have to go through a proper conversion. And so that Maimonides says will be the second step within nature, the gathering of the exile, that the temple will draw everyone to Israel to partake in that divine energy. Then Maimonides continues with this third point that will be with the coming of Mashiach, and that is the returning of all the laws to their previous state. So what does that mean? That means simply, on a very technical level, there are many, many laws which we cannot fulfill, many of the 613 commandments that we cannot fulfill if there is no king. For example, there's a law of hakel. Hakel is that at a certain time during the year, the Jewish people, men, women, and children have to gather within the temple, and the king reads from the Torah to all the Jewish people. So that's a law which is dependent on having a king, which we do not have, so we can't perform that mitzvah. There are various other laws. And then continues, there are other laws that are dependent on having a temple, sacrifices, other laws pertaining to the temple. No temple, we can't perform the laws. And then there are other laws that require the majority of Jews to be living in Israel, which we cannot fulfill either. As a matter of fact, the amount of the 248 positive commandments, because the negative commandments we fulfill by default if they're associated with the temple, no temple, we're not transgressing them, and so we're fulfilling them. But with the positive commandments, out of the 248 positive commandments, it is only possible to fulfill 87 of the 248. The remainder of the positive commandments will only be fulfillable with the coming of Mashiach. And so with the coming of Mashiach and the Jewish people's return to Israel, we will have the rebuilding of the third temple, and we will have the opportunity to observe all of the commandments once again. What will most symbolize this change will be the restoration of the Sanhedrin. As the prophet Isaiah says, text 7 on page 256, I will restore your judges as in the days of old, and your counselors as in the beginning. Afterward, you shall be called the city of righteousness, faithful city. I will restore your judges. What's that referring to? We have rabbinical courts now. We have judges. The idea is as follows. In ancient times, the judicial system had a Supreme Court. That Supreme Court was called the Sanhedrin. That was what the Supreme Court was called. It convened at the temple. It consisted of 71 judges. And each one of these 71 judges needed to have smicha, ordination. Now, any rabbi today was ordained, right? I was ordained. Any aspiring rabbi goes ahead, takes his exams, and gets ordained, gets smicha. But that's not a real smicha, that's a fake smicha. What do I mean by fake smicha? True smicha is smicha, ordination that was given by Moses to Joshua, and then by Joshua to others, and by others to others, in a direct line to Moses' ordination. These 71 judges had to receive ordination from people who had received ordination and so on and so forth back until Moses. They can know the Torah perfectly. They can know the Talmud verbatim, but if they did not receive ordination from someone who received it directly from Moses, they cannot serve as a judge on the board of the Sanhedrin. And so nowadays we just call it smicha, we call it ordination, but it isn't true ordination. And the Sanhedrin had many powers. They can affix laws. They can institute new laws. They can do various things. And the Sanhedrin was in existence even after the destruction of the Second Temple, which took place in the year 69 of the Common Era, up until roughly the year 360. In the 4th century, in the middle of the 4th century, the Roman persecution forced it to be shut down until the era of the coming of Mashiach, until the Messianic era. Where will it come back? Where will the Sanhedrin convene for the first time in the Messianic era? not in Jerusalem where they would always convene. Rather, they will convene in Tiberias. Text 8, page 257. Says Maimonides, originally when the Holy Temple was built, the Supreme Sanhedrin would hold session in its chamber of hewn stone. That was the chamber in the temple where the Sanhedrin would hold court. But when things went awry, the Sanhedrin went into exile, convening in various locations, 10 in total, the last being Tiberias. Since then, the Sanhedrin has not reconvened. We have a tradition that the Sanhedrin will be restored in Tiberias first, and from there, it will relocate to the temple. The restoration of the Sanhedrin, reconvening first in Tiberias and then move back to its original location in Jerusalem, will have a tremendous impact on Jewish law. And we'll give just one example, and that's the example of the Jewish calendar. We all know that the Jewish calendar is a lunar calendar, right? It's months of roughly 30 days, give or take. Today, for example, is Rosh Chodesh. It's the beginning of a new month. And if you go outside tonight, you barely will see the moon, if anything. You'll see the moon maybe late tonight, tomorrow night, a sliver, because it's a new moon, because we know that the Jewish month is based on the waxing and waning of the moon. In temple times, and according to Jewish law, initially, the way it is ideally supposed to work is that it's literally focused on the moon. There had to be witnesses who would go out, see the moon, see a new sliver of a moon, go to the Temple Mount, present themselves before the Sanhedrin, and they'd be grilled for hours, proving that they actually saw the new moon and not a reflection of something. And based on that, the Sanhedrin would decide that today is the first day of the new month, because it can either be 29 days or it can be 30 days. For example, this current month we are in is a month of 30 days. So today was day 29. Sorry, today was day 30. Yesterday was day 29. So if the two witnesses came to the temple last night, then the rabbis, the Sanhedrin, would have instituted that today is not day 30, rather today would have been day 1 of the coming month. And if no witnesses showed up, for whatever reason, then automatically the next day would be Rosh Chodesh, it would be a 30th day, and the next day would be the beginning of the new month. So in essence, really, you couldn't plan in advance because you had no idea what the calendar layout was going to be 1 month in advance. You wanted to make that Passover plans, the earliest you can make them is 2 weeks in advance, because 2 weeks earlier is the beginning of the new month. So the month was based on this Sanhedrin accepting these witnesses and declaring today is the first day of the new month, or today is the last day of the past month. Today is day 30 of the last month, or day 1 of the coming month. When did that stop? That stopped during the 4th century. The last leader of the Sanhedrin was a sage by the name of Hillel. Not Hillel the Elder, who we're all famous, who's famously known for his statements about loving your fellow as yourself, and don't do unto others that you don't think is nice, and the Hillel that we discussed earlier. Not that Hillel. This was Hillel, who was a leader of the Sanhedrin, the final Sanhedrin in the middle of the 4th century. And Hillel saw the pending doom, and in the power of being the leader of the Sanhedrin, he constructed a calendar based on a certain system till eternity. That's what he did. And that's the calendar that we follow till today. And so we can make plans 5 years in advance, 10 years in advance. You want to know when Pesach's going to be in 10 years? I'll tell you what day Pesach's going to be in 10 years. That's going to change. Mashiach comes, you won't be able to tell me when Pesach's going to be this year, because who knows what the Sanhedrin will decide. So that's one practical difference that the Sanhedrin will create. And so what we have here is the 3 ideas that Maimonides tells us will take place in the Messianic era. Again, following his line of thought that there won't be anything miraculous, rather maybe drastic. It's going to be amazing, but not miraculous. And those 3 are, the first one being the building of the temple on Temple Mount, the ingathering of the exiles, including, according to Rabbi Eliezer, the 10 lost tribes, and the idea that the ingathering of the exiles will be due to a draw from the building of the temple, both of those facilitated by King Mashiach himself. And finally, Maimonides tells us that there will be the reinstitution of all the laws symbolized by the reinstating of the Sanhedrin. What else will be in the Messianic era? Here comes an exciting part. We've heard of Armageddon, we've heard of the apocalypse, and we know that these are ideas that will be in the end of times. What does Judaism say about Armageddon? Where does it come from? Where does Armageddon come from? Reminds me of the joke that I said earlier about the end is near, but I said in a different class, so I'm not going to repeat it. Armageddon is a Greek word which means Mount Megiddo, or in Hebrew, Har Megiddo, or Megiddo. That's what Armageddon means. It means Mount Megiddo. In other religions, it's presented as a location for a final great battle at the end of days, with other religions coming out on the top. And it also refers to that era as the apocalypse, which is a Greek word for great suffering. And there isn't a parallel in Judaism because according to Judaism, there won't be such a thing as the apocalypse. But let's get to Armageddon. Many ideas from other religions, primarily Christianity, are taken from Judaism. Where'd they get this idea from? Obviously, it grew a beard and it grew lots of stories with it, but where'd they get this idea from? From Judaism. Where'd they get it from Judaism? The prophets, throughout Tanakh, throughout prophets and scriptures, they talk about a final battle that will be in the end of days. A great war that will occur. For example, in Zechariah and Zechariah, it says that there will be great mourning in Jerusalem due to this war, and he compares it to the mourning that once occurred, here's the key, in the valley of Megiddo. Not that the war will take place in Megiddo, but rather the mourning that will take place in Jerusalem when this great battle at the end of days happens will be akin to the mourning that took place in the past in the valley of Megiddo. For whatever reason, they took this idea of a battle that happened in the valley of Megiddo before the times of Zechariah, and they decided that that's where it's going to be known, and so they gave it the name Armageddon. What's this big battle? What is it called in Judaism? In the verse, it's called the Battle of Gog and Magog. That's what the battle is called. Gog and Magog. What's Gog and Magog? Gog is the ruler, the king of this people, and Magog is the name of his people. There's going to be this great battle in the end of days. Now, this great war generates lots of headlines. We want to know all about this great war. We talk about Mashiach's got to come, so this great battle has to be about to happen, and something we should be worried about this great war that's going to happen. So here's what Maimonides tells us. Here in the laws of Mashiach about this battle, text 9. Shmuel, can you read for us text 9, the lawyer, on page 259?
A straightforward interpretation of the prophet's words appears to imply that the war of Gog and Magog will occur at the beginning of the Messianic age. Before this war, a prophet will arise to inspire Israel to be upright and to prepare their hearts, as it is stated. Behold, I am sending you Elijah. Some sages stated that Elijah's coming will precede the coming of Mashiach. All these and similar matters cannot be definitely known until they occur, for these matters are not clarified in the prophet's words.
Thank you. So if we were hoping for Maimonides to give us a great description of this war, sorry to let your hopes down. We don't have a description. We don't know what this war is going to be. There aren't much details. But the Talmud gives us a little bit more insight not so much about the war directly, but about its impact it does or shouldn't have on us. Here's text 10, quote from the Talmud. Rabbi Yochanan taught in the name of Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, the famous sage Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, taught as follows: suffering a wayward child at home is more difficult than the war of Gog and Magog. For it is stated in chapter 3 of Psalms, a psalm of David when he fled from his son Absalom. And the next verse reads, Hashem, how numerous are my enemies, many have risen against me. By contrast, says the Talmud, regarding the war of Gog and Magog, it is stated, why are the nations in an uproar? Why do the people speak emptiness? It does not state how numerous are my enemies. What's Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai teaching us in this statement? This is what he's saying. There's 2 chapters in the Tehillim and Psalms. There's Psalm 2 and Psalm 3. Psalm chapter 2, Psalm chapter 3. What does Psalm chapter 2 speak about? It's talking about the verses quoted here. Why are the nations in an uproar? Why do people speak emptiness? In other words, they're wasting their time for being in an uproar. They're wasting their time for being in emptiness. What is this referring to? This psalm is referring to this final war of Gog and Magog, and King David is making light of it. Not a big deal. It won't be such a big deal. The nations shouldn't be so worried about it. People shouldn't be talking about it. It's emptiness. And the verse actually says, he who dwells in heaven laughs. And the verse proceeds to articulate how nothing will come of their nefarious plans. And so Rav Shimon is saying that this psalm is a reference to the battle at Gog and Magog, kind of belittling the entire battle. What is Psalm 3 talking about? The entirety of Psalm 3 talks about King David's pain. The beginning leads us with King David's pain, deep pain, of when he had to flee Jerusalem because of the rebellion of his son Absalom. His first words are, how numerous are my enemies, many have risen against me, which is expressing, and the opening of the psalm expressing deep pain and anxiety. We don't find this deep pain and anxiety expressed in reference to the war of Gog and Magog. And so Rav Shimon is analyzing the juxtaposition of these 2 psalms, one before the other. Both of them seem to be addressing a major crisis, but only one is King David considering something of importance, and that is the pain of his wayward son. And so Rav Shimon is telling us that we have nothing to fear. King David, the juxtaposition of Psalm 2 with Psalm 3 is telling us that Psalm 3 is something to worry about, something to be pained about, something to be anxious about. Psalm 2, the war of Gog and Magog, waste of time, nothing to be worried about. Why is it nothing to be worried about? There's various explanations for why there's nothing to be worried about. But continuing in this line of the juxtaposition of the 2 is that by having proper Jewish education to the next generation, by raising proper Jews and not having wayward children, that will encourage greater Jewish education, more meritorious Jews who are deserving of God's extra protection, which makes us all the more confident that there's no reason to fear at all because we'll have that extra protection. And to take it a step further, there's an old Hasidic tradition that teaches that the length of the exile, the suffering of the Jewish people throughout the exile, and the merits of the Jewish people has actually caused the complete cancellation of this war in the first place. As it's well known, and the Torah tells us that when it comes to prophecies, even directly from God in the verses, when God says that he will do something, if it's something positive, it must come to fruition. But if it's something negative, God could rescind it. And so when it comes to the battle of Gog and Magog, there's a Hasidic tradition that says that because of the length of the exile and all the benefits that we've had, the war will actually not take place. And so that's about this great battle of Gog and Magog. Armageddon is nothing to worry about. Finally, we have a complete description of Messianic prophecies that we addressed at length in lesson 1. Physical blessings, materialistic blessings that will occur when Mashiach comes. There won't be war, there won't be crime, there won't be poverty, there won't be scarcity, there won't be disability. And we went through all of these ideas, how we see that they're slowly but surely actually happening before our eyes. Maimonides actually summarizes all the verses and the prophecies in the next text. It's a little bit long, but we'll notice how Maimonides seemingly goes to great pains to explain that these will all not be miraculous changes within nature, rather they will all be amazing developments within nature. Text 11. The Messianic era is defined as the time in which sovereignty will revert to Israel and the Jewish people will return to the land of Israel. In those days, it will be extremely easy for people to make a living. A minimum of labor will produce tremendous benefits. This is the meaning of our sages' statement that in the future, the land of Israel will bring forth ready-baked rolls and fine woolen garments. The great benefit of that era is that we will experience respite from the oppression that prevents us from doing good. There will be a widespread increase of wisdom, as it is stated, for the earth will be filled with the knowledge of God. War and battle will cease, as it is stated, nation will not lift up sword against nation. The human lifespan will be lengthened as a result of the absence of stress and suffering. Giving a very natural explanation to all these seemingly miraculous statements of the prophets. Maimonides continues, we do not long and hope for the Messianic era simply because we desire an abundance of produce and property, or because we wish to ride horses or drink wine to the accompaniment of music, as some confused people think. Rather, our prophets and pious yearn for that era because then the righteous will assemble and good conduct and wisdom will prevail. It will be possible then to observe the entire Torah without worry and fear. The teacher gave an assignment, to say the story, the teacher gave an assignment to his students and said, imagine you won $1 million lottery ticket, write down on paper what you're going to do when you win that lottery. And so everyone fills out their papers and gives them their papers. And, this one talks about the cars they're going to buy, the houses they're going to buy, the vacations they're going to go on. And then Nathan's paper comes in, and the teacher looks in and it's blank. And the teacher says, I don't understand. Why didn't you write anything? And Nathan says, because if I had $1 million, that's exactly what I'll do. Nothing. Mm-hmm. What's going to happen when Mashiach comes, says Maimonides? What's the purpose of it all? The purpose of Mashiach, why there's going to be physical abundance, why there's going to be no war, no crime, no poverty, no disability, why are we going to have all these great advancements and developments within nature? Says Maimonides in the end of text 11, is so that we'll be able to be spiritual, purpose-oriented people. We'll be able to be people who will be focused on the study of Torah, will be focused on doing what we want to do, which we will want to do in the Messianic era, which is studying Torah, trying to grasp the divinity of it all and trying to understand godliness. Nowadays, we can't do that because we have all the stress and anxiety that stems from war, crime, poverty, scarcity, disability, and so on and so forth. When Mashiach comes, all that will fall on the wayside. We won't have any of that. And so we'll have abundance. We'll be able to focus on what our purpose is, to study Torah and to live a blissful life. That's the purpose. And so it's not that there'll be miracles that would happen. These things will fall on the sides and will disappear to enable us to fulfill our mission, our purpose. And really, this point has relevance to our lives today. Because as we discussed in lesson 1, yes, we're living currently in an era of tremendous prosperity relative to what our ancestors lived, even 100 years ago. We have it a lot better and a lot easier and a lot more prosperous than it was. And so a real Jewish way to regard these blessings is to say, you know what? These blessings are really enablers for me to perform more mitzvahs than my ancestors were able to, because they had real stresses of life. They had to deal with real poverty back in the shtetl. They had to deal with real sickness and real issues. Nowadays, it's a lot easier for us. Obviously, we still have our problems. I'm not saying that no one has problems. We have issues. And God willing, with the coming of Mashiach, everything will be resolved, may it be speedily in our days. But it should give us an insight to notice the blessings that we have and to use them for more focus and more time spent on the things that matter, whether it's the fulfillment of the commandments, strengthening our relationship with God, or relationship with other people, our families, our friends, and so on. And so again, Maimonides goes through these ideas all in chapter 10, chapter 12, 11, 12. He goes through miraculous things that aren't really miraculous, he explains. They're going to happen within nature. There's just one problem with Maimonides' view of things. What's the issue with Maimonides' presentation? They say the story of the miser in town who was not just a miser, he was famously known for never giving a penny to anyone. He was super rich. He's lying on his deathbed and he calls the rabbi and he says, Rabbi, I have a request from you. He says, yes, you're dying bed, whatever you want. He says, in the corner there's a box and it has all my money. It's sitting there in the box. I want you to take that money. The rabbi says, sure, which charities should I give it to? He says, don't give it to any charities. I want you to hold it in a safe place. And just before you're passing, I want you to give it to the next rabbi with the same rule that he should hold it and give it to the next rabbi. So the rabbi turns to the miser and says, Yankel, I don't understand your logic. That sounds absurd. The miser turns to him and says, what, Rabbi, you don't believe in the resurrection of the dead? The resurrection of the dead is a problem that's posed, that opposes seemingly Maimonides' view. What is Maimonides telling us? That everything happens within nature. Tell me, is resurrection of the dead, Tchias HaMesim, resurrection of the dead, is that something that you can explain away? The verse is clear about it. Torah is very clear that it's a fundamental aspect of Judaism, the resurrection of the dead, and that's as far as from nature as possible. There is nothing natural about it. Not only that, if you go through chapter 11 and 12, which he talks about the Messianic era, Maimonides fails to mention anything about the resurrection of the dead. As a matter of fact, following Maimonides, during Maimonides' times, there were people who wanted to explain that Maimonides was going to explain away resurrection of the dead as a natural occurrence of some sort. Maybe people will suddenly be enlightened, but it doesn't mean literally. There's just one problem. They missed out that earlier in his book, he does mention the resurrection of the dead as a literal occurrence. Not only that, and we mentioned this in lesson 2, in his 13 principles of faith, one of the 13 principles of faith, Maimonides spells out clearly, is the faith of Tchias HaMesim, the belief that when Mashiach comes, there will be literal resurrection of the dead. Hearing these ideas and hearing these people who are trying to read into Maimonides, not mentioning it in those final things and blaming their mistaken beliefs on Maimonides, in 1191, Maimonides authored an epistle titled The Letter of the Resurrection of the Dead, Tchias HaMesim. And in it, he states clearly that there will be the resurrection of the dead. But he knew that that will force him to revisit the idea of presenting everything in a natural manner. And so here's a quote from that letter, the letter on resurrection that Maimonides wrote. It's a fascinating letter. I think they're all available online. The numerous letters of Maimonides are quite fascinating. But here's an excerpt from the letter of resurrection, text 12, page 266. It is important to realize, says Maimonides, that when I stated that certain prophecies are to be understood allegorically, this is not absolute. No prophetic communication informed me that they are allegorical. Nor did I receive a tradition from the sages and prophets that these particular matters are parables. Let me explain what brought me to the allegorical approach. I strive to bring harmony between the Torah and human intellect, which is why I explain things in a natural way whenever possible. However, when it is self-evident that the connotation is miraculous indeed, and it is not possible to interpret otherwise, I say that it is a miracle. The bottom line is that regarding specific prophecies about the redemption that do not involve the fundamentals of our Jewish faith, it matters not whether one believes that they are literal or allegorical. We will have to wait for the realization, may it occur speedily in our days, to discover whether these statements refer to actual miracles or simply allegories for natural changes. And so it's quite possible, says Maimonides, that all the prophets who gave these prophecies, it'll actually be literal miracles going against nature. People will live for eternity. There won't be any mortality. There won't be any deaths. People will live forever. The lamb will dwell with the wolf, literally. Food, delicacies will grow on trees. Clothing will grow on trees, literally. All of these, says Maimonides, it's possible that it will all be true. And the reality is we'll only know when Mashiach comes, when we'll be living in the Messianic era. But on the other hand, says Maimonides, all these are not necessary. There doesn't have to be these miracles. The only miracle that must occur is the resurrection of the dead, because that's a literal miracle, and that's a fundamental part of Judaism. How do we reconcile this idea? Why would Maimonides choose the literal over the allegorical? Is it literal? Is it allegorical? If you recall last lesson, we touched upon the idea of being worthy or unworthy if Mashiach will come before its intended time or at its intended time. If the Jews are worthy, then it'll come earlier. Unworthy, it'll come at the set time that God had decided. And so the Rebbe explains as follows. In an unworthy scenario, in an unworthy scenario, there won't be any miracles. Everything will happen in its natural manner. In a worthy scenario, that's when the miracles will happen literally. So if the Jews are worthy and Mashiach comes before its intended time, then there will be all of these miracles literally. If it's unworthy, then there won't be any miracles except for the miracle of the resurrection of the Lord. But how does that add up? That there will only be one miracle. So the reality is that in a situation where it's unworthy and Mashiach will only come at its intended time and not earlier, there will be two phases. There will be the first phase where there won't be any miracles whatsoever. And then there will be the later phase with the miracle of Tchias HaMesim, resurrection of the dead, and perhaps even all the other miracles will happen. And so Maimonides, in his code of Jewish law, he's negating miracles. Why does he do that? One answer is one that he said he's kind of erring on the side of caution, trying to make everything match within nature. But an additional explanation is this idea that what are the miracles? The miracles are contingent on the Jewish people's behavior. Maimonides wanted to ignore this aspect of it because a code of Jewish law shouldn't state contingencies that are dependent on human behavior. It should state only that which is fact, which is definite. And so Maimonides shied away from this aspect of if they're worthy, there will be literal miracles in his code of law. But in his letter on resurrection, he explains why he chose this side and that it is very possible that it will be. Which leads us even deeper to this idea that what is the purpose of miracles? What's the purpose of Mashiach? The coming of Mashiach, what's the idea? The idea is that it will be a time when the divine will be revealed, when everyone will want to spend all their time focusing on living a godly life without disturbance. In order for that to be accomplished, miracles aren't needed. It can all just happen in a natural way, as Maimonides spelled out, and we'll be worry-free, anxiety-free, relieved, relaxed, and able to focus on living a godly life without any disruptions. And so if it's not necessary, if they're not needed, then Maimonides is telling us, focusing on the function of the Messianic era, is that that's all that matters. All that matters is for us to be able to function on the purpose of the Messianic era. And so that's why Maimonides defines the Messianic era as unmiraculous, even though he acknowledges that it may be miraculous indeed, and definitely there'll be the resurrection of the dead. And now, within the resurrection of the dead, in his letter, Maimonides discusses various points of the teachings and the beliefs of the resurrection. And so we'll focus on one of them, and that is the idea is, how come there's no clear verse in the Torah that there will be resurrection of the dead? In the prophets, there are clear verses. In the scriptures, there are clear verses. But in the Torah and the 5 books of Moses, there aren't any clear verses that talk about the resurrection of the dead. If it's such a fundamental point, why is that the case? And so Maimonides addresses that and gives the following response. Text 13, page 268. The resurrection of the dead will occur as a miraculous event, as we have explained. However, the credibility of such an event can only be based on the words of a prophet. Right? If someone tells us now that there'll be the resurrection of the dead, it can't be any person. For us to believe in the resurrection of the dead, there has to be a prophet who tells us this belief. So continues Maimonides. Now, at the time of the giving of the Torah, nearly all of mankind denied the transmission of prophecy from God to humans. They also denied that God could perform miracles, considering them instead acts of magic or trickery. They were in Egypt. They were around magic all the time, sorcery all the time, black magic, whatever you want to call it. And so they saw the plagues not as miracles, not as an aspect of prophecy, but rather as great magic or trickery. Indeed, the Egyptians denied that Moses performed godly miracles and tried to show that they could turn sticks into snakes by other means. The Jews themselves were influenced by this worldview, evidenced by their expressing astonishment that Hashem revealed himself to them at Mount Sinai, indicating that they had considered prophecy impossible. That's how surprised they were at Mount Sinai. How then can such a miraculous event that relies exclusively on belief and prophecy be conveyed to those who are not ready to accept the concept of prophecy or the concept of a miracle? They wouldn't be able to hold it. When God wished to give us the Torah, he first had to produce the great miracles recorded throughout the Torah to authenticate thereby the prophecy of the prophets and the possibility of miracles. For that reason, at this stage, Hashem only divulged the concept of reward and punishment that occurs within the scope of nature. Hashem did not mention anything about resurrection. This continued until, after the passage of generations, the belief in prophecy and miracles became verified, and there remained no doubt about their truth. At that point, the prophets shared with us that which God had informed them regarding the resurrection of the dead. By that time, it was easy to accept the belief. So what Maimonides is telling us is that a prerequisite to believe in any prophecy, there has to be 2 points. There has to be the belief in prophecy, and there has to be the belief in the possibility of miracles, which the Jews at the time of the giving of the Torah on Mount Sinai lacked in both. They didn't believe in prophecy and they didn't believe in miracles. Only after the 40 years of going through the desert, witnessing the prophecies coming true, witnessing the miracles and happening before their very eyes, now once they entered Israel and the prophets started, now they were ready to accept any prophecy because they now believed in prophecy and in the possibility of miracles. God had verified, authenticated to them that there is prophecy and there are miracles. And so once God verified it and authenticated it to them, they believed in the resurrection of the dead. It was told to them by the prophets, and they passed on that authentication that they were presented and that belief from generation after generation until us. And so to this day, we emphasize every single Passover the miracles that God had done, which demonstrated God's complete control over nature and the fulfillment of his prophecies. These are different ideas that will occur in the Messianic era. And as I mentioned, this is not an exhaustive, comprehensive idea on the topic. We briefly went through various aspects that will happen during the Messianic era. There was so much more to discuss on all these topics. As a matter of fact, there's a course just on Mashiach, on each topic of these Mashiach, of this course, 4-week course on each one of these topics. And even that only scratches the surface. There are many books about the coming of Mashiach. But what's the purpose? What's the purpose of this whole course? We studied it for 6 weeks. We now come to the realization that there will be the resurrection of the dead, there will be the coming of Mashiach. What is the purpose of the resurrection of the dead? Why is it necessary to have a resurrected world? So on a very basic level, it's a matter of reward. Looking at it from the bigger picture, what the purpose of Mashiach is, what the purpose of the world is. Now that we know what the purpose of the world is and where we're headed, the trajectory of the world, on a very basic level, the idea of resurrection of the dead is the idea of the reward. Because during people's lives, they didn't receive the reward of all the work they've done to bring about the coming of Mashiach. And yes, they're now in heaven, and yes, they're reaping their reward spiritually, but hey, it was a joint effort, the body and the soul. It's not fair that just the soul is getting reward now in the world to come. The body's not getting any reward. So there has to be resurrection of the dead. So all those people who worked so hard can get a reward for all the good work that they've done while they were here in this world. Body and soul, just as like when they did the work. On a deeper level, it's not just getting the reward. On a deeper level, it's the idea of experiencing the results of what a person did. As we explained, when one does a mitzvah, what does it do? It transforms the world. Every single mitzvah throughout history transformed the materialism of that mitzvah into something spiritual. So should the people who contributed to this sacred project, it's a culminative reward that comes at the end of it. So all the people who contributed to this project, they should not partake in the results, in the outcome? Of course they should. So they all have to come back to be a soul in a body to partake in the outcome. Because a soul in the Garden of Eden, no matter how holy it is not the outcome of their work. It's not partaking in the outcome and the results of their work in the physical world. Only in the physical world is that ultimate transformation, which leads us to the third purpose of resurrection. Once the world is transformed, where else will God be? Where else will God be if not in the physical world? Where else will be the greatest revelation of divinity if not in the physical? In the physical, a body with a soul in it in the physical world. Because the entire world will be transformed, the concealment will be entirely peeled back, and the physical realm will be completely transformed into the ultimate home for God. And so at that point, that's where it's going to be at. The holiest, the most spiritual place will be in the physical world because of the transformation of the physical. Which leads us to conclude the entirety of the course with a very powerful statement. And once again, what better way to present it than with a joke? So an out-of-towner is driving his little old jalopy throughout the outback, throughout the Midwest, and the car lands in a ditch. No one around for miles. He's screaming for help. His phone has no service, and he's calling for help. And suddenly he hears something in the distance. He turns around. There's a farmer riding a horse. So he calls out, and the farmer comes, and he shows him his car's in a ditch and needs some help. So the farmer gets off his big, strong, muscular horse, and he's talking to him, buddy, we're going to take care of this. Farmer takes some rope, some string, he ties it to the car, and he hollers and he says, pull, Coco, pull. Nothing happens. A few seconds later, he hollers, pull, Nelly, pull. Nothing happens. A few seconds later, he screams and he says, pull, Buster, pull. Nothing happens. Then he kind of mumbles nonchalantly, pull, buddy, pull. And Buddy schleps the car and it comes out of the ditch. So this guy walks over to the farmer. He thanks him profusely for helping him take it out of the ditch. He says, but I don't understand. Why did you call 3 random names before you told Buddy to take it out of the car? He says, you see, my friend, Buddy is blind. And if he thought he was the only one pulling the car out, he would never try. So I had to call other horses to give him the idea that he's pulling it with other people, with other horses. And then he pulled it out himself. Every single mitzvah, and really this is the objective of the entirety of Judaism, is to transcend, not to transcend the physical, but to transform the physical world. How do we transform the physical world? By each mitzvah that we do. Every mitzvah that we do at every moment of our lives is transforming the physical world and ushering in, enables us to live the reality of redemption. Every single act matters. As we see in text 14 from Maimonides, page 270. Maimonides tells us in his book of laws, you should view yourself at all times as equally balanced with merits and faults, and view the world similarly, equally balanced with merits and faults. Therefore, if you perform one mitzvah, you tip the balance, your own and that of all mankind, and effect personal and global deliverance and salvation. That's all it takes. You're one more putting on tefillin, you're one more lighting Shabbos candles, one more time of studying Torah. Every mitzvah we do reveals the essence and godly purpose in a certain part of creation. Who knows which mitzvah, maybe this Torah study will be the one that will tip the scale and bring Mashiach, may it be speedily in our days with the coming of Mashiach, immediately, now, as the Rebbe would always say, Mashiach now.
Lesson 6. And then. 1. In his halachic code, Maimonides states that we should not presume that the world's nature will change in the Messianic era. Prophecies implying otherwise are to be understood as allegories. That said, this era will be marked by huge changes. 2. One radical change, a complete end to antisemitism and total independence for the Jewish people. 3. Mashiach will rebuild the Jerusalem temple to the applause of all nations, who will recognize the benefit that God's sacred home offers the entire world. 4. Non-Jews will also experience the redemption. The Jewish redemption is a universal concept. 5. Building the temple will cause the global ingathering of all Jews, who will recognize its great sanctity and desire a share in its environs. 6. The return of the 10 lost tribes is a matter of Talmudic dispute. Some attribute the uncertainty to the tribes' assumed assimilation. Regardless, it is undisputed that all 12 tribes will be represented in the land of Israel. 7. The possibility of observing all of the Torah's laws will return. due to the existence of the Jewish monarch and temple and the reality of Jews living securely on their land. 8. The Sanhedrin, forced to disband centuries ago, will return. One resultant change will be that the Jewish calendar will revert to a system of observation. 9. The Jewish prophets mention a great war associated with the Messianic era, but the prophecies are difficult to interpret with any certainty. Rabbi Shimon demonstrates by applying Psalms 2 to this war that the threat and tumult will amount to nothing. 10. The cessation of war, crime, poverty, scarcity, and disability will enable us to fully fulfill the purpose for which God created us without pain or worry. 11. In his Epistle on Resurrection, Maimonides clarified that nature-altering miracles may indeed occur in the Messianic era. We are aware of one, the resurrection of the dead, but others are possible as well. 12. The resurrection is important because it will enable all who participated in making this world into a home for God to share in the magnificent outcome. It will also demonstrate the complete spiritual transformation of the body and, by extension, the entire physical world.